A collection of 120 rare early photographs of China, some of the very first images ever taken in the country, is making its debut at the Tsinghua University Art Museum in Beijing. Images of China's people, cities, landscapes and architecture captured in the 19th century but frozen in time peer out from the frames. Some of the earliest photographs of Beijing, sweeping views of Fuzhou and the Ming River, and important early portraits of the diverse people of the late Qing dynasty grace the museum's walls. The photographs all belong to the Loewentheil collection, which is the largest, rarest, and said to be the most valuable of its kind in the world. What stories can these images share about China's rich past? What can we tell about the social changes the country has undergone by revisiting these scenes from the past? Why have these photos landed in China, and what does the collector have to say about China's today and tomorrow? I'm pleased to be joined by the collector himself, Stephan Loewentheil, who is in Beijing for the exhibition. Welcome to the show, Mr. Loewentheil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To be here.
I understand the title of the exhibition is Vision and Reflection, Photographs of China in the 19th Century from the Loewentheil collection. So 120 rare photos of early China. Tell us a bit about the entire situation of this collection. When were they captured by whom? And why they're here?
Well, on a personal level, I've captured them over the last 30 years, trying to put together a comprehensive collection of photographs taken in China during the earliest years of paper photography. Paper photography came to China in the late 1850s, and most of the photographs in the collection are between the 1850s and the 1880s, although in later days we've extended the story into the early 20th century. And the object was to do a cross-study of China sociologically. Everyone who was photographed, many of the great monuments, many great landscapes, and to show the history to the best possible way for posterity.
Yeah, it is the first time that such an exhibition is ever staged in China?
It's the largest collection to be shown at one moment in China, particularly focusing on the 19th century photography, which goes back further in time than most photography that's available presently.
So what are some of the highlights that you want to, what are some of the gaps you want to fill in for both researchers and ordinary viewers?
Well, I think one of the most important things is the very physical nature of China has changed so dramatically in recent years, as in all urban situations throughout the world. But China is particularly dramatic in that at the time photography came to China, the landscape and the buildings really hadn't changed that much in hundreds of years. And suddenly the very powers that brought photography, that's technology and industrialization, were to forever change China. So one of the things that's important to me is to show the old China, to show the foundation upon the great nation has grown. The whole country is shown from another time, looking in a window into time, visions into the past. So that's one of the things we want to show. And the second thing, obviously, is the nature of people's lives. Everything from domestic lives to occupational lives, to travel, to trade. All of these things have changed so dramatically due to industrialization. And we're trying to show the Chinese people a slice of their past.
Some of the photos, would you like to highlight for us to illustrate what you were just talking about, for instance?
Well, the earliest comprehensive view of China was done by a man named Thomas Child, who was somewhat of an amateur scientist. But he traveled throughout Beijing and worked with the Chinese people very closely to get a cross-section of all the activities in China. The very first photos, however, were taken by a man named Felice Beato, who came during a French and English expeditionary force to take some pictures in the 1860s, which are the very first pictures to survive in Beijing. And he took many of the important royal buildings, Summer Palace, for example, which were later to be destroyed. So his pictures are important because they retain the original fabulous architecture and visions of China in the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, you talk about Mr. Loewentheil is also a little bit controversial because he kept, as you said, he came during the period of the Second Opium War, and he shot the fantastic architecture of the Summer Garden shortly before it was burned down. So by showing this kind of image to the Chinese people for the very first time, what do you want to tell?
Well, personally, I hope that they'll take the broad view of his work, in that he did a comprehensive photographic essay on what happened through the war, and I think there's a lot for all societies to learn, that warfare brings destruction. And I think that's a very important thing, that it's bad for culture and it destroys our cultures. And I think Beato recognized that, in that he took pictures of the great monuments both before and after the destruction. So I think that's one important lesson. I think one of the most important facts I want to make clear is that the early Chinese photographers were geniuses. They were artistic geniuses. They learned very quickly from their Western counterparts who brought photography here. Many of the young Chinese people started as assistants, but rapidly became masters. So you have a photo like The Waterfall by Lai Fang, which is a masterpiece in any culture. And museums throughout the world haven't exhibited these pieces of great art. Now, once in a while, a single picture will be shown as history, but I think it's very important that the world began to understand that the Chinese photographers were as great as any of the European photographers. Now, some of the European photographers who came did take fabulous pictures. This monastery by John Thompson, for example, is in his book, Traveling Up the River Min. He was the first photographer to go inland to China from the port cities, and he took photographs that are extremely rare. He created only 20 books, of which only 8 survive, of his photographs.
From an artistic point of view, the Chinese, we had the Chinese landscape, right, where we don't really have one focus and spanning out to observe the world. We have many focuses in one painting. So I wanted to say there is a different perspective, different artistic tradition. Is that kind of reflected in the
I think
different
it is.
photos?
I think the great landscape photographers of the Chinese drew upon their history from the paintings and became masters at interpreting in a particularly Chinese perspective. Interesting to note also is that a man named William Saunders took pictures that were then colored in. And those colored pictures drew heavily on the tradition of Chinese painters. In fact, many of the men who painted those pictures were people who had worked as painters previously and adapted to the new technology. So I think that's an important factor, to see how technology is adapted by people who are artists to begin with.
In terms of subject matter, I also noticed there are a lot of portraits. What are some of the things that you value the most when you collect a photo and show them?
We have a beautiful portrait by a Chinese portrait photographer named Pun Lin, which shows a mother with a baby on her back. And he managed to capture them in an amazing natural moment where the child is looking out at the world and the mother is carrying the child on her back. And I think that's the kind of humanity that can pass from generation to the future to tell us things that you don't read in a history book. And I think that's a very, very important thing, to understand that people in their hearts were much the same, although culture changes a great deal.
Absolutely. Well, looking at these photos, there is so much information hidden in there, right? So much history, so much art, so much about that period of time. What would you like to do on top of showing the aesthetic part, on top of showing the nostalgic part of it? What do you want to enlighten people to do?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is that the Chinese people have always been among the greatest nation in the world in terms of their respect for history, their respect for their culture. And I think photographs have much to tell us and to tell the Chinese about visual past. They haven't really been studied. There are a number of reasons, but more important is looking forward. We'd like to see a collection like mine studied by Chinese intellectuals, Chinese scholars, and I think that there's a lot to be learned by everyone, not only artistically but historically, in the study of photography, sociologically.
So in the process of preparing for this collection, what have you discovered that you were not aware of in terms of dealing with the Chinese people, or their perception of such a collection?
Oh, that's a good question. In terms of what I've learned in dealing with Chinese, is that Chinese have an enormous respect for art and culture, but photographs have not really been treated in the artistic sense with the honor that many other museums and cultures have. And if there's something I can do to aid that change, I think that would be a very, very important effort. Furthermore, that once the Chinese people are exposed to these photographs, they're fascinated, they're interested, they're amazed, like any other people.
It's a part of our life. It's a part of our gene.
And absolutely, and it's just been neglected for a while. Photography fell out of favor, and now I think it's going to come back. People will recognize how important it is to bring this culture back.
And also, have you noticed there's a renewed interest, perhaps, in these historic archives of our past as we look forward to how we want to go down in history, how we want to go into the future? There is an urgency, are you feeling, that the Chinese want to know more about what happened to them a century ago, a century and a half ago?
Yeah, I think it's very important. It's been said often that, we learn from the past, and if we don't learn, we repeat the past. And I think China is changing so dramatically, so quickly, that we should look at the past and see what changes are affected by technology, because we face a new technological era. And I think it's very important that we think about the unforeseen consequences of technology. For instance, the architecture that's represented in many of these photographs, they're gone. We've lost them. And these photographs would allow us actually to recreate some of them, recreate some of the great architecture. And I think that the positive and negative aspects of technology is one thing we find in photography.
Yeah. Well, you must have looked at these photos again and again, maybe held them in your hands, and now that you come to China and you lift your head, you are in China, looking at a completely different era. What is the biggest contrast that impressed you?
Well, the biggest contrast is something that one sees in every major urban environment, is that cities have become vertical, and China had a great horizontal culture. The small streets, the small alleys, the small stores, the family businesses, these are things that are represented in these pictures, and society is changing in many ways. And I think those are important things to notice from the photography. The other thing is there are great landscape photographs here that were taken by landscape masters, and as every country that's becoming industrialized in America and here, the landscapes are changing. And I think we can be reminded the importance, which China does, wonderful national parks, as America does, but we want to preserve some of our landscapes when possible.
But in looking at people, in dealing, in interacting with the Chinese people, do you somehow feel that the people who are standing in front of you could be very much in common with the people captured in the pictures?
Well, I personally believe that there's a great identity, that people have the same problems now, many of the same problems as they had then. Everyone's concerned about their family, everyone is concerned about their job, everyone is concerned about their day-to-day life.
They had their limitations in terms of understanding.
That's right. And I think that by looking back to the past, we can be humbled by seeing how similar people lived, and we can learn from different eras how to move forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stephan Loewentheil.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
My interview with Stephan Loewentheil from the Stephan Loewentheil collection of historical photograph of China collection. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. It's at The Point.